Welcome to our Digital Opportunities webinar series. I am Ann Byers, the Digital Equity Manager for the state of Nebraska. I'm with the Nebraska Information Technology Commission and Office of the CIO. We will be meeting on most Wednesdays at 11 a.m. going into May or June. And the webinars provide an opportunity for us to learn together and to support state and regional digital equity planning efforts. Today's webinar will focus on broadband availability and mapping, including the BEAD grant program, and how that relates to the Digital Equity Planning Grant. Please put your name in the chat. This will help us track attendance. If you would like to be added to our email list, please also include your email in the chat. We will be recording the webinar. A copy of the slides and a link to the recording will be available on the NHT's website. The Nebraska State Digital Equity Planning Initiative is part of the Connect Nebraska Broadband Initiative. The planning grant is being led by the Nebraska Information Technology Commission, Office of the CIO, in partnership with the Nebraska Regional Officials Council and the Nebraska Library Commission. This initiative was funded by a Digital Equity Planning Grant from the National Telecommunications and Information Administration. Recording slides and links to resources are posted at broadband.nebraska.gov and nitc.nebraska.gov. And before we get started, I'd like to give you an update on upcoming webinars. On March 8th, we'll be discussing makerspaces and digital equity organizations. We have three great speakers: Michael Sowers from the Do Space, David Martin from the Nebraska Innovation Studio, and Christine Flyinghawk from the Center for Rural Affairs. And then on March 15th, we'll focus on STEM and technology workforce development with Shauna Dorsey from the Nebraska Tech Collaborative, Andrew Wang from Prairie STEM, and Candace Miller from the AIM Institute. And then on March 22nd, we will focus on the Affordable Connectivity Program, and we have Anthony Butler from the FCC lined up to talk about that, and I'll be lining up some additional speakers for that. Next, I'm going to hand it over to Colin Robbins. Colin is the director of the Nebraska Universal Service Fund and Telecommunications at the Nebraska Public Service Commission. And Colin always does a great job talking about broadband mapping and the grant. So I am going to stop sharing my screen and turn it over to Colin.
All right, thanks, Ann. Let me see if I can find the right screen to share for myself. So I'm going to try and jump around a little bit between both just a few slides on PowerPoint and then some kind of actual map information here. So let me share and get started here. Okay. All right, so I thought I'll dive into some of the mapping resources that are available today, but I thought it might be helpful to kind of set the table by going through a little bit of history on how we got to where we are today. That would kind of mean we talk a little bit about where broadband mapping got a start and why it was done the way it was done for a long time. And then we'll talk a little bit more about recent improvements and the process for getting better mapping information. And then I'll try and show some of the existing map resources. And then I'll hit on funding for broadband, which probably isn't a whole lot of news to everybody, but we'll go over some of the existing funding resources. And then I'll touch a little bit at the end on just some of the coordination that that happens and will be happening between the digital equity portion of the NTIA process and the BEAD portion of the NTIA process. So let's get started with that. Okay, so prior to about 2010, there was never really a great coordinated effort to map broadband availability. I think probably companies did map some of their own information in terms of who they could serve and where, and certainly companies have had plant maps and things like that that have shown exactly where their infrastructure is, but there was never any effort to show that outside of their own company, essentially. About 2010, there were some federal dollars that were made available to states for a number of different activities, but it included broadband mapping. And Nebraska did utilize that funding to start mapping broadband within Nebraska. Basically, the process at that time was to reach out to the individual carriers, give them kind of a guidelines around how we wanted to see broadband availability reported, and have them report back to us. And this was really, so if people have heard of the FCC 477 mapping process, this was really a precursor to that. And again, Nebraska did it kind of on our own. Other states did similar activities, but Nebraska really, Nebraska was certainly one of the states that helped kind of refine that process that was later taken over by the FCC. So again, we wanted to map information on a census block by census block level. And there were a few reasons for doing it that way. One is that census block boundaries and delineations were readily available. They were about as granular of a data set as was generally available for something that was feasible to map. And if we were able to get broadband data on a census block by census block basis, the other advantage is that it was obviously tied to a ton of demographic information, so you could start to get some ideas around how many households are covered, and what populations were unserved and underserved, and that kind of stuff. You see on the map there on the screen on the slide some of what that allowed us to do. So we could do comparisons between times between like 2010 and 2013, and that was a useful tool at the time. There's rightful criticism of the FCC 477 mapping process today, but at the time, 13 years ago, it was by far the best information we had. So like I said, it allowed a lot of initial comparisons and a lot of initial ideas on where service was and was not available. A little more information on census blocks. They're a little bit hard to kind of get your head around what they are, because they're really just areas that are bounded by visible features. So like it says, there are roads, streams, railroad tracks, property lines, city and township boundaries, county lines, school district lines, that kind of stuff. Those are all boundaries for census blocks, and there's no minimum of, for example, households that have to be within a census block or anything like that. There are plenty of census blocks with nothing in them, literally. So it's just delineations of area developed by the Census Bureau, and they, as we mentioned before, collect a lot of demographic information based on those delineations. Let's see. So one of the major limitations, of course, with that is that the size of a census block can vary beyond extremes. So next slide here is a census block where there's nothing in there. It's probably, I didn't measure the size of it, but it's probably like 50 feet by 50 feet by 80 or 90 or something like that. And that's probably not even the smallest census block that you can find, but it's essentially just a little area bounded by a couple of streets that you can see there and a path. There's no home in there. Looks like there's maybe a couple telephone poles, but that's about it. And then you contrast that with this. this is, I think, the largest census block I found in Nebraska. It's, you know, over 200 square miles in size. There are homes in there that are separated by 12 miles as the crow flies, let alone by how the roads are arranged there. And it's just a huge area out in the sandhills. And so when we initiated the broadband mapping process, it essentially had carriers report whether they could serve a house in a census block. And when you have homes that are separated by 12 miles, that causes obvious problems if a carrier can only serve one of those houses, and you essentially consider the whole census block served because the carrier reported it as served, even though there's only one house in it, that this can cause problems, that there's plenty of opportunities for houses to not be served just because one in that census block is served. So back up a little bit, we did that state mapping process for about 4 years, and then the FCC made the decision to assume that process themselves and do it nationwide. So it wasn't like we exactly set the process up for them to copy, but they essentially copied the same process that we had already been using, where they collected information from carriers twice a year. Every carrier was required to report census block by census block where they could serve at least one household within the block. And then it was kind of reported, the FCC made that information publicly available eventually. There was a time lag, but essentially you could look census block by census block and see where a carrier reported service. So again, this scenario where you have massive census blocks, which is not unusual in Nebraska, causes a lot of problems with that mapping process. Okay, so that kind of brings us towards today. That census block by census block mapping process was really just discontinued officially. I think it was about a few months ago, where the FCC announced that they were no longer going to be collecting the 477 data from carriers. And so the new map, of course, is the FCC's broadband map. It was probably about 4 or 5 years ago that there were starting to be some efforts to develop a new broadband map. I think everybody kind of realized that the 477 process had kind of run its course, and that there was a need for much more granular information about broadband availability. There's way too many errors with those census block issues that we were talking about earlier, and that we needed something better to really assess where broadband is and is not available. It took the FCC a while. I'll just say a while to get that process up and running. Finally, about the middle of last year, well, let me back up a little bit further. Probably 1.5 years or 2 years ago, there was kind of a pilot mapping effort that was started by a couple of entities and one of them was CostQuest, who the FCC now uses as a vendor. But there's kind of a pilot project in a couple of states to look at how to get more granular information. They essentially set up the prototype for this broadband serviceable location fabric. So essentially it's finding the actual, kind of putting a point wherever there's a broadband serviceable location. And that's what really has carried over to the FCC broadband map now, where they have this, what they call the fabric, or a statewide collection of all those locations on the map. And those are broadband serviceable locations for purposes of broadband mapping. And so the FCC is really running two processes kind of concurrently. They're trying to get the broadband serviceable location fabric kind of corrected and improved. So they're modifying broadband serviceable location fabric, or the BSL fabric, at the same time that they're collecting availability information. And so it gets to be a little bit confusing. They run cycles where they'll allow challenges to the broadband serviceable location fabric, and then they have to kind of figure out that process and then release the new fabric back out to the carriers to report availability. So there's kind of a stepwise process that has to happen. And in a lot of ways, the processes are running at the same time. And so I mentioned the availability piece, where kind of like it used to be before, except where carriers are required to report information based on that fabric instead of census blocks like they did before. But it's essentially the same reporting process, where they they have a version of the fabric and they report which locations they can and cannot serve. And there are a couple of ways that they can do that. They can essentially draw polygons around the areas that they serve and submit it to the FCC that way, or they can, I believe, go in and just take the fabric and report which locations they can serve individually. I've kind of touched on that there are challenge processes that are part of both of those pieces. So both the location fabric challenge process and the availability challenge process. Most people are probably more familiar with the availability challenge process, where we're trying to refine which carriers actually can serve which locations. But just keep in mind, there are really two challenge processes that are part of the FCC's overall mapping process, and they're occurring, like I said, kind of as we speak. I think at this time I might stop the presentation quickly and just go through the FCC broadband map a little bit to give an idea of what that's like. Let's see. So, okay. So hopefully everybody's at least seen the FCC broadband map. This is what you'll see when you go to it. It's broadbandmap.fcc.gov is the URL for it. And when you first open up the map, there are really a few different options. You can obviously type in an address immediately, and it'll take you to information for that address. I'll just type one in real quick. When you start typing, it'll autofill. This is a location in Lincoln, and it'll zoom into that point. And when you start zooming in, you'll see all those green dots. Those are broadband serviceable locations. And on the right-hand side of the screen, it'll pull up all the providers that report being able to serve that location and their service levels that are available there. So in this location, there's a handful. It's in Lincoln, so there are, Allo, Charter. Let's see, there's obviously some fixed wireless options, and both licensed and unlicensed, and then some satellite options as well. Whenever you're in a location like this, you'll see if there's been any challenges to that location. On this one, you'll see that there has been an availability challenge, or I just actually chose how to submit an availability challenge, but you can see this little one with the circle means that there has been an availability challenge. If you scroll down through the provider information, you'll see that it was on telephone and data systems. That's really US Cellular. And if you click on the little number and hit details, it'll tell you what the nature of the challenge was. So in this case, it's that the provider does not offer the speed reported to be available at that location. Location summary is probably how most people want to consume the map, I would guess, if they're interested in just what's available where. When you click on the location button there, it'll pull up this map, and you can use the wheel to zoom in to specific locations. everything will show up as a hexagon until you get far enough in that it'll start showing you individual broadband serviceable locations. And again, when you click on green dots or dots in the availability in the location summary portion, you'll see the information on the right side that pops up on availability. And when you're in the location summary, this is where you can also submit availability or location challenges. When you click on that availability challenge option, it pulls up the providers that report service there, and you can, if you want to challenge one, you can hit the select button and it gives you a form to fill out to complete that challenge. Kind of the same process for location challenges. You click on location challenges on the location challenge option, and it gives you a bunch of options on things that you can that you'll need to fill out to submit that challenge. Go back to the home screen and show you a couple of the other options available. Providers, when you click on providers, you can look at a specific provider's service. So on the right hand side of the screen, you'll see add provider. If you start typing in a carrier, it'll make you select the technology, and it'll start bringing up service for that state. So gives you a little bit of percentage of the units covered on the right hand side. That's, I believe, a percentage of the units in Nebraska covered. So it's a small percentage, but this gives you some idea of what Great Plains provides in terms of copper service. And again, you can refine some of the information by clicking on the little gear looking thing, and you can choose between residential and business service. You can look at different speed tiers that are available, and you can also adjust the percent coverage threshold. I personally don't find the provider detail information to be quite as helpful. You can layer on, for example, if you want to see where Great Plains has fiber as well, you can type that in, and it'll pull that up as well. So just an FYI, I believe Great Plains has overstated some of their fiber coverage, but that's where they report it as of right now. The third option, and I do find this pretty helpful, is to the area option. So when you click on that, you go to the top of the screen, and it gives you some options for how you want to look at different areas. You hit the little drop-down menu. You can look at it by state, by county, congressional district, tribal area, census place, and CBSA, which I can't remember what that stands for. Somebody's told me before, but I've forgotten. But you start typing in a county. Oops. Selecting county. And we'll go to Platte County, Nebraska. It'll give you a little bit of an outline of that county and show you the hexagons again. But from here, if you want to refine things a little bit, you can again use the little wheel. For example, in this case, we have 100 by 20 selected as the speed threshold, and the technologies we're looking at are cable and fiber. And so you can see how that coverage lays out with those options selected. And if you want to make changes to that, just look at fiber, for example. That's how you do it. With these other options, when you zoom in, it won't ever bring up the actual locations. It'll only show you these hexagons. Well, actually, that's not true. It will give you locations when you zoom in. Red dots basically mean that they are not served, and then green one with that technology, green dots mean they are served with that technology. So. And then finally, let's see, the last option on the broadband map is download. So if you click on that and you're kind of into the data piece of it, you can get a lot more detailed information. It's all tabular, so you'll be pulling up spreadsheets on with a lot of information included in there. Let's see. So that's really the FCC broadband map. Let me stop sharing that. I'll touch on a couple of other mapping efforts that I think can be helpful resources. Actually, I'll bring up another demo here. So I'm going to bring up our state broadband map, which is at broadband. Let's see, broadbandmap.nebraska.gov. This is, there we go. So one caveat to our state broadband map at this point, it still is based, a lot of the information is still based on census block by census block data, and the underlying information is still FCC Form 477 data. So again, just keep that in mind when you're looking at it. But I think the primary utility of this map is to see where a lot of the existing broadband efforts are. So for example, I guess I'll talk more about funding sources, but there are a lot of existing programs that support broadband both within the state and federally. And you can pull up just about all of those on this map to see where projects are occurring or have occurred that have brought broadband to different areas. So for our first round of Nebraska Broadband Bridge, which is the broadband focused grant program that the PSC administers, if you click on that LB 388 Broadband Bridge Grant Program option, it'll show you the areas that were approved for grants in that 2021 cycle. And let's see. If you click on them, it'll bring up the information for that specific project. In this case, the applicant was ATC or Arapahoe Communications. The project name was North Arapahoe Holbrook. There were 30 unserved locations that will get service as a result of that project. And you can see the total cost of the project and the amount that was awarded to them in a grant at the bottom when you click on that. Some other things that are available on that map are NUSF projects. So I'll click on those as well. You can see this is our and some of this is probably a little confusing. We can probably improve our labeling a little bit, but NUSF 99 is a program that supports price cap carriers. So CenturyLink, Windstream, Frontier. And again, when I click that option on, it brings up the projects that we have approved in the last 2 years for those two, for CenturyLink and Windstream. Again, when you click on them, it'll pull up the information on those projects, and the area shown, of course, is the area that the project will occur in. Sorry. This is a project in the Chapel area, and you see the number of households that'll be covered and the area that's covered by that project. Going down the line here, just to make sure you're aware of what all the options are, NUSF 92 is a wireless tower funding program that the Commission administers. When you click on that, it shows you all the towers that have been supported through that program. Mostly, we're talking about cellular coverage here, so it's an attempt to approve on holes in cellular coverage. But again, that might be helpful in some applications. Next one down is NUSF 108. So this is a program that is available to all of the rate of return carriers. And when I click on that, you'll see the projects that we've supported that will bring broadband capable networks to those areas. And again, when you see those areas pop up and click on them, it tells you who the carrier is, number of households covered, and the area of those projects. And again, through our NUSF, all the projects supported have to be a minimum of 100 by 100 megabits per second down and up. There's also a lot of information on federal support, and I'm going to take some of this stuff off so it doesn't get too busy and confusing. So the Federal Universal Service Fund administered by the FCC has paid for a number of different projects over the years. ACAM 1, when you click on that, that shows you the areas that were supported through ACAM. Now, some of the support was for 10-1 service, so it's probably kind of irrelevant at this point in terms of getting something that's truly broadband capable, but that's given that these are areas that receive federal money, they're areas that we have to kind of take into consideration when we're looking at other funding sources and trying to get better service to these areas. It's kind of the same for ACAM 2. It's a little bit different program, but and it really goes to carriers that have, for the most part, already deployed fiber. Like most of the areas that you see pop up in brown there are Northeast Nebraska, and again, they're fiber to the prem, so that's just part of the FCC's program there. I'm not even going to click on the price cap carrier CAF option there, because again, that's the speed requirements for that are kind of outdated, and so we basically allow projects now to overbuild where CAF money was given by the FCC. We also have, so there were 2 federally run reverse auctions in recent years that were conducted, the CAF 2 auction and the RDOF. And both of those were essentially auctioning off pieces of CenturyLink and Windstream and Frontier territory that they were not going to be able to serve through the existing federal programs. And so those auctions did award some areas in Nebraska. And again, it's the CAF 2 auction did have a little bit lower speed thresholds, but I believe for the most part in Nebraska, all the carriers that won are supposed to provide at least 100 by 20. And then in the RDOF auction, all of the winning carriers essentially bid with fiber to the premise or technology that's capable of symmetrical, well, 1 gigabit down, and I think it was 500 up. I have to double check that. But either way, it's essentially fiber, although AMG or Nextlink does plan to utilize some fixed wireless to meet that speed requirement, which we're a little bit skeptical of, but we'll see what they can do. So, and then finally, one more thing that I wanted to hit on. The USDA has the Reconnect program, which is a broadband program, and they have awarded grants to American Broadband in Nebraska for a couple of areas. One of them kind of in the northern Rock County, southern Kippahaw County area, and then a couple of locations kind of in northwest Madison County and in Pearson, Wayne, and Cedar County. So those are all fiber deployments, and so that's more information just for people that are trying to understand where existing projects have happened. We do kind of reflect what is reported on the 477 data in terms of cellular coverage. So if you were to click on cellular coverage, it would show you where they report cellular coverage in the state. Let's see if it pops up here. It's a big data set, so sometimes it can take a while. Again, given that we believe some of their coverage is overstated, it may not be particularly helpful, but just something that users should be aware of. And then we have speed tier information at the bottom. This is again based on FCC Form 477 data, so I wouldn't necessarily put a lot of stock in what is shown on those speed tiers. One more map I want to show you really quickly. It's dedicated specifically to the Broadband Bridge program, and the URL is a lot harder to we don't have a very condensed version of it, but you can find it if you go to our psc.nebraska.gov website. This is really tuned more towards the Broadband Bridge program, and it lets you see a lot more detail on what's going on with Bridge. So as part of the Bridge program, especially in 2022, we required applicants to provide location data. So show us exactly where the locations are that you're going to be serving through these projects. So when you click on 2022 grant award areas locations, you can see the actual locations that were part of essentially approved projects. So there's a couple of things that we need to iron out here with some of these locations not being in the award area, but again, that gives you some idea of locations that are served through some of these projects. And then we have both 2022 and 2021 Bridge area grant awards delineated, so you can see which ones were 2021 and which ones were 2022. And then we also included some of the same info that we have on the other map, just so there's some context on where projects are happening. But those are really our state mapping efforts that are going on today. So let me go back to the presentation for a second. The other thing I wanted to mention is that we're in the process of, we're in the process of developing a new state broadband map. I'm hopeful that we will kind of consolidate these two state maps into one that's a little bit more, well, conveys the same information, maybe makes it a little bit more user-friendly, but also provides a little better detail on some things. That is, again, just in development, but we're hoping to have at least something to show on that sooner rather than later. So let's see. These are put up on the screen there, just the mapping resources that we've talked about: FCC broadband map, Nebraska broadband map, and the Nebraska broadband bridge map. Those are the three we've covered. We've really gone over most of the funding sources already in at least a little bit of, kind of an overview. Our Nebraska Universal Service Fund requires 100 by 100 symmetrical service for anything that we support through the NUSF. We showed you some of the areas where that covers. Federal USF, that's a little more of a kind of all over the place, because depending on the program, the speed requirements can be different. Broadband bridge, again, anything supported through broadband bridge requires at least 100 megabits per second symmetrical. Thus far, everything that we've supported through bridge has been fiber to the premise. If there's any other attempts to use alternative technologies, they have to essentially show us that it's capable of meeting that speed threshold. USDA Reconnect grant program, a couple pieces of information on that. The funding for that was somewhat limited, and it was kind of a competitive grant process nationwide. And probably the most important thing to keep in mind on the Reconnect program is that the requirements for areas eligible for USDA Reconnect grants were pretty strict. And so there were a lot of areas that didn't initially qualified for USDA Reconnect grants. That's changed somewhat in more recent years with some of the additional federal funding that's been put towards that program. And so there may be opportunities for other Nebraska entities to avail themselves of the USDA Reconnect grant. Capital Projects Fund. This is funded through the Department of Treasury allocation to Nebraska. This is kind of similar to Broadband Bridge, and there is a grant cycle that is open right now. That grant cycle, so the applications are due on Friday for that grant program, and we're hoping to have awards made by the end of June for capital projects funds. Again, 100 megabits per second symmetrical is the requirement for that program. And then finally, BEAD. BEAD is kind of in planning stages, as I'm sure you're all aware right now. We expect that we probably won't initiate a grant cycle until 2024 at the earliest. That'd be my expectation at this point, but some of that's still kind of in process of determining how that'll work. We're going to have to look at some modifications, maybe if we use, for example, the bridge framework for allocating grants, because there are some differing requirements with BEAD, especially with respect to speeds. BEAD only requires 100 by 20. And so we'll see how we kind of make that, merge those two together. I mentioned briefly that we're kind of in the planning processes for BEAD. So what we're in the process of working on now is our 5-year plan. That's due in August, and that really lays out what Nebraska's priorities and goals are, and takes a look at where we're at now. So it's kind of a snapshot of where the state's at right now and where it wants to go. And as part of that, there are a couple of ways that both digital equity and BEAD have to be closely aligned. One is that our goals have to be, we have to be essentially aiming for the same target. And so we need to make sure that our goals match up. And, you know, I suppose in some ways they could be goals. And a lot of the objectives that have to be identified through the digital equity planning process are things that we also have to report in our 5-year plan. So that's another opportunity for cooperation between Ann and the digital equity group and the BEAD side. If you want more detail on the 5-year plan, in our webinar this afternoon at 2 o'clock, we'll be going through that in quite a bit more detail, and Ann will be presenting there on digital equity as well. So just another plug for this afternoon. And I think with that, I kind of covered that on just my information up there. I will stop, and I'm happy to answer questions that anybody has or discussion points that anybody wants to cover.
Are there any questions for Colin? That Jeff has a question. He's asking, how often is the GIS information updated? For example, he did not notice that Superior, INET, or Glenwood were indicated on the map, which both provide broadband and or fiber.
I muted myself temporarily there, sorry. Depends on, I suppose it depends on which map you're asking about. The FCC's broadband map is supposed to be updated, I think, at least twice a year, although I think that's their eventual goals, to update that information twice a year, because they're collecting it from carriers twice a year. If you're talking about the state maps, we update those on an ongoing basis. Again, I mentioned the underlying data is FCC 477 data, but our own information about where we provide grants and that kind of stuff is updated continually. Just depends on when we have updated information. You're mentioning that you didn't notice Superior, INET, or Glenwood indicated on the map. Again, I'm not sure if you're talking about the FCC map. They should both be on there, and I admit I haven't checked lately, but I would think they're both on there. We can probably look it up in real time if we wanted to. I guess one thing I'll mention on the FCC broadband map that can be a little bit confusing when you're looking at things from like a provider by provider. Sometimes if you don't know the company name as they submitted data to the FCC, it can be a little bit hard to find. Don't think that should be a problem for Superior INET, or well, I shouldn't say that. Sometimes the fixed wireless carriers have different DBAs and stuff. And Glenwood, I'll mention, does have a few different entities. So Glenwood Telephone Company, Glenwood Telephone Membership Corporation, those are really, they're both subsidiaries of Glenwood. And then Glenwood Network Services is a third entity as well. So just something to keep in mind. So Glenwood Telephone Company didn't really show anything fiber to the premise. Glenwood Telephone Membership Corporation is where you'll see some of the fiber to the premise information in a little more detail. So let me share the FCC broadband map screen here. Yeah, so when I put in Glenwood Telephone Membership Corporation, this is the areas that were shown in Nebraska where they provide service, and that is accurate with my understanding. Let's see, I'm just scrolling through the questions. Josh, you asked about alignment between digital equity planning and BEAD planning when the due dates are different. That is going to be a trick. I will say that. So the trick is that the 5-year plan, which is supposed to incorporate digital equity planning information, is due before the digital equity plan is due. I'm hopeful that we will be able to kind of synthesize a lot of the information that's being collected from the regional digital equity plans and that kind of stuff to include in the 5-year plan. There will be a trick, but I'm hoping that, again, also that some of the goals and objectives that are part of the digital equity plan will already be kind of laid out at that point, so that we'll be able to just pull them into our 5-year plan. But it is interesting that those two timelines don't exactly line up.
Yeah, and I'd just like to add that every other state is dealing with this too. And I think that we will have some draft goals, some benchmark data, things like that, that draft materials that can be incorporated in, and then probably states can say that they will continue to consult with the digital equity plan, or to make revisions or something like that.
Yeah.
Make further refinements.
Yeah, I don't know. My kind of guess is just that they want to make sure that you're not, going down two completely different paths with digital equity and BEAD, which I don't really see as being an issue.
So I have a question too. So I've been trying to go through and looking for benchmark data. What would you recommend that we use for benchmark data for broadband availability?
Ooh, that's a good question. Even though I'll say, the FCC broadband map is a long way from perfect, it's probably the best data set we have available right now. I think given that we have options for sorting through some of that data, I think we could probably exclude entities that we don't necessarily agree with what they're reporting. So I think that's probably the best source of information. The trick to that is just that it's a lot of data, and it takes a little bit of work to sort through it all. But that'd probably be my recommendation at this time. And I guess the other thing is we'll have another updated version of the map sometime probably late spring, early summer, I think. I can't remember the exact schedule, but that will be presumably an improvement over the first version.
Okay. Well, I will probably talk to you more about the exact parameters. I would like to at least maybe start to prepare that for right now, for as we're doing our planning. Use the most recent version and then update it. Any other questions for Colin?
So one pop up there about Valley County. So the question about Valley County, I'm trying to look. I know Valley Ord itself, I think, is a frontier territory, and they've been a little bit slow on getting service to that area. One thing I didn't really touch on was we did attempt to do a state-run reverse auction, which would have included a fair amount of the area around Ord. So I guess a couple of answers. One, if you look at the bridge program map, some of Valley County is covered by Nebraska Central Telephone Company. They were purchased a year and a half or 2 years ago by Hamilton Telephone Company and are in the process of getting fiber to the premise through all of that Nebraska Central territory. The other part of it is served by Frontier, and that's kind of a different story. I don't have a good answer for time frame on that part, but at the very least, BEAD will focus on unserved locations, of which I'm guessing there are quite a few in Valley County. So that's a kind of roundabout answer that I think it'll be. If it doesn't get addressed before then, it'll probably be something that BEAD addresses.
Colin, I have a question. I had just, per your map, you pulled up Great Plains Communication. It showed that it covered an area with fiber. I just reached out while I was on the phone and already got a message that said that, nope, we don't provide fiber to the phone to that address, but the map says that it does. So is that a grounds for, because you even said, I wonder if it looks like it might be overstated, and sure enough, it is, with those lovely hexagons. So then we submit a challenge saying they can't provide fiber to that area. We have to do that every single time.
You can. I'll just mention that we did submit a significant number of challenges to Great Plains' coverage as a state. So we did a bulk challenge on a lot of Great Plains locations because we found the same thing in a lot of their communities, and it's they're aware of the problem, and so I'd expect that the next round of data would show a different story. And but yeah, they overstated pretty significantly in a lot of places.
So still helpful if individuals do it in addition to what? Okay.
Yeah. So one thing I did was we had noticed there an issue with places that they reported fiber, and when you look at a location on the FCC map, it'll show you the address. So you type in the address into Great Plains' little widget or whatever you want to call it on their website, and it says, no, I'm sorry, we can't serve you with fiber at this time. And so I don't know how many times I did that, but I can't remember how many thousands of locations we challenged, but it was a significant number where they just clearly aren't making fiber to the premise available for a lot of their locations. So like I said, I would expect that the next round of FCC maps will show a different story for them.
Any other questions? Okay, I'm not seeing anything more in the chat. So thank you, Cullen. And if you're interested, there's another webinar at 2 o'clock that the PSC is hosting. So you're welcome to join that. I'm sure that that information is on the broadband.nebraska.gov website.
Yeah, yes, if you just go to our PSC website, there's should be able to find information on it, or send me an email and I'll be happy to forward it to you.
Okay, well, thank you, everyone. Happy Wednesday. For those of you up north, hope you weather this snowstorm well. So thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Ann.
Thank you.